The gavel hadn't even fallen when Officer Raymond Colt made the last mistake of his career. He saw a black man in an off-the-rack gray suit sitting alone at the defense table. No lawyer, no backup, no legal pad except a single yellow one he'd apparently brought himself, and he ran the calculation the way he'd run it 100 times before in this building. Cheap suit, Pro C. Alone. Colt leaned back in the gallery's front row and felt the comfortable weight of a foregone conclusion settle over him like a familiar coat. He had no idea that the man he was about to lie about under oath had neutralized armed combatants in 3 separate countries. He had no idea that the man had volunteered specifically deliberately, after 4 months of federal planning, to be dragged from a car on a rain-soaked street so that this exact moment could happen. He had no idea that the cheap gray suit had been purchased with cash from a Goodwill donation bin in Smyrna, Georgia, as a costume. A very specific, very intentional costume. And he had absolutely no idea that the battered leather briefcase sitting at the defense table contained beneath a flush-fitted false bottom a military-grade encrypted satellite communicator that was going to trigger the most consequential phone call Raymond Colt had ever been adjacent to. Stick around, because what unfolds in the next 90 minutes doesn't just end one corrupt career in Cobb County, Georgia. It walks 31 innocent men out of prison, dismantles a shakedown operation that has been bleeding this community for a decade, and frees a 22-year-old pre-med student named Jalen Cross who has been sitting in a Georgia state prison for 11 months for a crime he did not commit. Every single piece of it comes down to one phone call. And the man who makes it is sitting in that cheap gray suit right now, looking at nothing in particular, as still and composed as a man who has already won and is simply waiting for the ceremony to begin. His name is Marcus Webb. He is 34 years old. He is a chief petty officer in the United States Navy SEALs. And Raymond Colt just decided he was an easy target. Courtroom 7 of the Cobb County Superior Courthouse had given up on optimism somewhere around 1989 and hadn't reconsidered since. The fluorescent panels overhead produced a buzz that sat just below the threshold of conscious irritation, not something you heard so much as felt a low electrical complaint permeating behind your back teeth. The wooden gallery benches were packed with the morning's docket, a woman in nursing scrubs holding a speeding ticket, citation, a teenage boy whose mother was straightening his collar every 90 seconds with the anxious precision of someone who believes presentation is the last variable she can control, a man in paint-spattered jeans who had spent the last 20 minutes staring at his phone like it might offer him a portal to somewhere else. Ordinary people, tired people, people who had arrived at Courtroom 7 on a Tuesday morning expecting the routine indignities of a low-stakes legal proceeding and had no framework for what was actually about to happen in front of them. Marcus looked at none of them and registered all of them. The bailiff, Gerald Monroe, per the duty roster Marcus had obtained through Reeves, standing near the side door with his thumbs in his belt, borsfish an in door in undercalf and tiyid. The single courtroom camera mounted high on the right wall, its indicator light steady red, the double doors at the rear, their hinges, the way they swung inward, the distance from the witness box to the defense table. 4 strides, 4.5 if Colt was moving with purpose. Marcus had measured it in his head the morning before walking the room during the public access hour. He placed his hands flat on the defense table and felt the cool worn oak under his palms. Inside his jacket's breast pocket pressed against his ribs was a folded piece of paper. Not a legal document, not an operational note. It was a printout of a voice message transcript generated by his phone's transcription software and printed at a Kinko's in Marietta 3 weeks ago. The message was 53 seconds long. It had been sent by his brother Damon from the Morehouse Research Lab at 11:40 on a Wednesday night, approximately 6 weeks before the stop on Pinecrest Avenue. It was a voice message about a paper Damon was reading on cochlear regeneration in zebrafish, about how under very specific conditions the cells responsible for hearing could be coaxed into rebuilding themselves, and Damon had been so excited about it that he'd sent the message in 3 segments because he kept running out of breath. Marcus had listened to it 17 times. He had printed the transcript because he wanted something physical to carry. He carried it to every operational debrief, He carried it to the safe house apartment in Marietta. He carried it now in the breast pocket of a $23 suit into the courthouse where Raymond Colt was about to commit federal perjury. He allowed himself one internal acknowledgement of the full weight of where he was and what he was doing, sitting in a courthouse alone, charged with crimes he had not committed. Dressed like a man the system had already decided about, waiting for the person who had hurt his brother to walk into a room and lie in front of a judge. And Marcus was going to let him. He was going to sit completely still and let Raymond Colt build the lie brick by carefully rehearsed brick in a room with a court reporter and a federal record, and then he was going to dismantle every single brick in view of the same judge who'd watched it go up. And then he was going to make one phone call. He picked up the black pen and wrote 3 words on the yellow legal pad. "Hold the line." Then he set the pen down, pressed his palm briefly over the breast pocket where the folded transcript rested, and waited for the gavel to fall. 14 months before courtroom 7, Marcus Webb was sitting on the edge of a canvas cot in a forward operating position in the Horn of Africa, eating a cold MRE of chicken and rice and reading a message from his mother. 3 lines. Damon had been in an accident. He was in the hospital. She didn't want Marcus to worry. His mother was a woman who had described a Category 4 hurricane that took out their power for 2 weeks as a situation. She had called Marcus's SEAL qualification an accomplishment. She did not use the word accident loosely. He was back in Atlanta in 31 hours. He found Damon on the 4th floor of Grady Memorial, connected to a monitoring unit, their mother asleep in the chair beside the window, with her shoes still on. When she woke and saw Marcus in the doorway, something in her face shifted, not into relief exactly, but into the particular expression of a person who has been holding an enormous weight alone and has finally found somewhere to set it down. Damon Webb was 22 years old. He was a second-year pre-med student at Morehouse College with a 3.87 GPA and a part-time position in a molecular biology research lab on campus that he talked about with the infectious enthusiasm of a man who has found the specific thing he is meant to do with his life. He sent Marcus long voice messages from the lab, rambling, excited, full of discoveries Marcus only partially understood and found entirely admirable. He sent them even when Marcus was deployed in regions with irregular communication windows. He sent them anyway. The messages were always waiting. In the hospital bed with the left side of his face still swollen and one arm in a brace, Damon was trying to tell Marcus what had happened. The words kept escaping him. Not because he was confused or medicated, though he was both. Because the traumatic brain injury he had sustained when Raymond Colt drove his knee into the left side of Damon's skull against the asphalt of Pinecrest Avenue had disrupted the language processing function in his left temporal lobe. The doctors used measured clinical language. His mother translated it plainly. His words get mixed up now. He knows what he wants to say. He just can't always find it. The hearing loss in his left ear, approximately 40% caused by the secondary effect of a taser discharge at point-blank range, had been identified by a specialist brought in on the 2nd day. The damage was in the language of the report, permanent and non-recoverable. Damon's last voice message before the stop, the one about cochlear regeneration in zebrafish, had been sent from a man who could speak in complete rushing sentences about the rebuilding of hearing cells without any awareness that 14 months later he would be one of the people who needed them. Marcus sat at his brother's bedside for 4 hours that first night and listened to everything Damon could give him, which came out in fragments. Words arriving and then retreating, replaced by other words that were close but not right. The sentence assembling itself slowly while Damon watched his brother's face for cues. Marcus did not offer reassurance. He did not say it would be okay. He held his brother's hand the way he hadn't since Damon was 7 years old and had fallen out of a tree in their grandmother's backyard in Decatur. He held it and he listened, and he committed everything to the kind of memory that doesn't fade. What he learned over those 4 hours, Damon had been driving home from the lab at 11:47 on a Friday night, following his usual route through the Pinecrest neighborhood 8 minutes faster than the alternative. He had been stopped by Officer Raymond Colt for an alleged broken taillight. He had placed both hands on the steering wheel immediately. He had announced his movements before making them. He had offered his Morehouse student ID alongside his driver's license. He had asked Oneies in a voice he described after 3 attempts at the word trying, steady, trying, plain, settling, finally on careful. He had asked once in a careful voice why he was being stopped. That question had cost him a temporal lobe injury, 40% of his hearing, and the laboratory voice that could produce 53 seconds of breathless excitement about zebrafish. The Internal Affairs Division cleared Colt in 11 days. Justified use of force. Difficult split-second decision. The union's statement used the phrase high-stress environment. The district attorney's office declined to pursue charges. Pinecrest, at the time of the stop, had a violent crime rate of 0.3 incidents per 1,000 residents annually. It was one of the 15 safest neighborhoods in Cobb County. Marcus stood in the hospital parking lot on the second night under a sodium lamp in the cold, looking at that number on his phone. He stood there long enough that the lamp's automatic sensor cycled off and he was standing in the dark. He didn't move to trigger it again. He thought about Damon searching for the word careful while Marcus sat 3 feet away and waited, keeping his own face still so that the search wouldn't become a performance. Then he made a call. Special Agent Dana Reeves of the DOJ Civil Rights Division answered on the 3rd ring. She listened without interrupting. When Marcus finished, she was quiet for 4 seconds. He counted, and then she said, "Colt." Raymond Colt, 4th Precinct, Metro PD. Marcus said yes. Reeves said he's number 8 on a list of 31. The planning took 4 months because the evidence had to be built the way a building is built, foundation first, every load-bearing element in place before the next layer goes on. A single structural failure would collapse the federal case. More importantly, it would collapse Marcus, who had volunteered as the operational center of a federal sting and had no intention of doing it twice. They met in a rotation of locations across Metro Atlanta, a federal field office in Buckhead, a law firm conference room on Peachtree Street, a parking garage in Sandy Springs. Never anywhere connected to the Navy, to Marcus's service record, or to his real name. During the operation, the man who existed was Derek Cole, a freelance HVAC technician from Bankhead, who drove a car that, in the judgment of a certain kind of officer, could not possibly belong to him. The car was a 2023 Dodge Charger, Obsidian Black, registered to the Derek Cole alias through a federal documentation chain robust enough to survive a basic DMV check and thin enough to dissolve under forensic scrutiny. It was to the eye a beautiful car in the specific way that certain men find threatening when driven by the wrong person, which was the entire point of it. The FBI's technical division spent 11 days fitting it. 4 recording units installed in concealed positions, one in the headliner above the driver's seat, angled to capture exterior approach at the driver's window. One behind the dashboard panel for interior coverage. One in the rear seat assembly covering the rear window and approach from behind. One external unit in a housing matched to the factory taillight assembly for wide-angle roadside coverage. All 4 in low-light high-definition mode, all 4 feeding a live uplink in the trunk to a surveillance van Magnetic Plumbing Company signs on its sides, parked on Ashford Lane, 3 blocks north of the planned stop location. A technical agent named Okoye, who spoke in precise, unadorned sentences, monitored the feed. Biometric contact sensors on the steering wheel recorded grip pressure, pulse rate, and hand position in real time. If Marcus's hands left the wheel, it was documented. If a defense attorney later claimed he'd made a threatening gesture, the sensors would call that a lie. The transmitter was sewn into the lining of Marcus's jacket collar by Okoye himself, the size and thickness of a large postage stamp, a paper-thin lithium cell, 12-foot audio capture radius, crystal clarity. Not a recording device in the legal sense. A transmitter feeding live audio to the van. The van recorded everything. The rules of engagement were established on a Tuesday afternoon in the Buckhead office with 2 DOJ attorneys and a court reporter making an official record. Marcus would drive through Pinecrest on Colt's shift, follow all traffic laws precisely, pull over immediately, offer identification, answer calmly, not resist physically under any circumstances, even if force was applied, not identify himself as a federal task force participant, under any circumstances, even if directly asked. He would absorb the arrest. He would be booked. He would go pro se. Because the courtroom was the final recording device, the most important one. If they could get Colt onto the witness stand under oath before a judge and a court reporter, then every lie he told became part of the permanent federal record. And Reeves was certain he would lie because men like Colt, Apis, had been lying in this courthouse for 18 years, and the lies had always worked. The trial was the rope. The arrest was just the bait that got him to grab it. On the last day of planning, Reeves looked across the table and asked Marcus one question she had been saving for the end. Was he prepared to take a physical beating? Not metaphorically, the word plainly. Was he prepared to be tased, to go down on wet asphalt, to be handcuffed and booked, and to do none of that in a way that revealed his training or his identity? Marcus thought about the transcript in his breast pocket, the voice message. 53 seconds of his brother running out of breath over zebrafish. Yes, he said, I'm prepared. Reeves nodded. Phase 4 triggers on assault on a federal officer. That might happen on the street, or it might happen in the courtroom if Colt loses control on the stand, if he makes a move on you in front of the judge and the gallery. She paused. That's actually a better outcome. More witnesses. More documentation, more charges. Marcus thought about 4 strides, about the squeak of leather soles on courtroom linoleum. I'll be ready, he said. The rain began around 9 that evening and settled in with the Georgia autumn's characteristic refusal to be hurried. By 11:30, it had softened to a fine, cold drizzle that made every surface on Pinecrest Avenue gleam amber under the streetlights. The neighborhood was quiet, the particular quiet of residential streets whose residents have paid in one form or another for insulation from disturbance. Marcus drove the Charger at 28 in a 30 zone. Both hands on the wheel. The collar transmitter was active. All 4 recording units were active. On Ashford Lane, Okoye had confirmed clean feed on all channels at 9:47 p.m. He drove Pinecrest Avenue for the second time. The first pass at 10:15 had confirmed Colt's cruiser in its documented position, the pull-off near the intersection of Pinecrest and Magnolia, engine idling. Marcus had noted it without slowing and continued to the end of the avenue, turned around, and begun the second pass. At 11:52, the blue lights erupted in the rearview mirror. Marcus let out a controlled breath through his nose. He checked his speedometer, 27. He signaled right. He eased to the curb. He put the car in park, turned on the interior dome light, lowered the driver's window, and placed both hands at 10 and 2 fingers spread and flat. The biometric sensors registered pulse 64, both hands on wheel pressure stable. In the van on Ashford Lane, Okoye made his first notation of the night, 23:52. Contact initiated. Colt's door opened. The spotlight activated the side-mounted unit angled at the driver's mirror, the disorientation tactic. Marcus let it hit his eyes without looking away. He waited. Colt's footsteps were unhurried. He had the wide stance and forward lean of a man so accustomed to this motion that his body performed it without conscious instruction, hand resting near the holster, not on it, the posture of someone who wants you to notice the proximity. He arrived at the window and looked down at Marcus with the calculating, dismissive gaze of a man running a familiar equation. License and registration, Colt said. Not good evening. Not even an inflection that acknowledged Marcus as a person rather than an obstacle. Good evening, Officer, Marcus said. His voice was level, unhurried, deliberate in its absence of anxiety. My license is in my jacket pocket, and the registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for them now. Go ahead, Colt said with the tone of a man for whom courtesy is a provocation. Marcus retrieved the Derek Cole license and held it out through the window with 2 fingers. Colt took it without looking at it. Know why I stopped you? I don't know. Colt's eyes were on the interior of the Charger, on the leather on Marcus's suit jacket, on the car itself. The equation running this car, this neighborhood, this man. Broken tail light, Colt said. Marcus said nothing. The diagnostic report would be pulled in the morning. The taillight was not broken. He waited. Where'd you coming from? coming home from a friend's place. Officer, in Pinecrest, off Ashford Lane. The slight jaw movement of a man receiving an answer that doesn't fit the picture he's already decided on. He glanced at the Bankhead address on the license for the first time. "Step out of the vehicle," he said. "May I ask why, officer?" "I've provided my license, and I'm happy to provide I smell marijuana," Colt said. He said it the way he had said it before, easily, reflexively, with the practiced ease of a man whose lies have become indistinguishable from his instincts. Step out. There was no marijuana. There was nothing in the Charger except Marcus a water bottle and the operational package the FBI had spent 11 days installing. But the words were spoken. The transmitter caught them. On Ashford Lane, Okoye noted 235433 subject Colt verbally claims marijuana odor. No basis. Documented. Marcus opened the door and stepped out into the rain. The drizzle soaked through his jacket immediately. He stood beside the Charger with his hands open and visible at his sides. He was considerably larger than Colt might have calibrated from the window, broader across the chest, built in the specific way that 12 years of SEAL conditioning builds a man not for appearance but for function. Colt registered it with a brief recalculation that changed nothing about his approach. The pat-down found nothing, because there was nothing. Colt stepped back. He looked at Marcus, at the Bankhead address, at the Charger, at the man in front of him, who had done nothing wrong, and he did what men like Raymond Colt do when evidence refuses to cooperate with their conclusions. He manufactured a story that would make the evidence unnecessary. "You were reaching under your seat," Colt said. "I wasn't," Marcus said. "I saw it before I lit you up. I had both hands on the steering wheel." "Officer, the registration, turn around. Hands behind your back." The handcuffs went on before Marcus had fully completed the turn. Colt put them on hard, the punishing tightness of a statement, metal biting into bone. Then Colt's hand closed on the back of Marcus's jacket and pressed him face forward against the roof of the Charger, and Colt leaned in close. Close enough that Marcus could smell cold coffee and something synthetic. And he said barely above a whisper, directly into the fiber of Marcus's collar, where the transmitter was catching every syllable at crystal fidelity. "That's what happens when you drive a car that isn't your son." Marcus kept his face turned away from the rain. He thought about a voice message, 53 seconds, zebrafish. A man running out of breath from excitement. He thought about his brother spending 45 minutes searching for the word careful. He held completely still. On Ashford Lane, Okoye picked up his radio and sent one word to Reeves Clean. Phase 1 was complete. Ada Nathan Forsyth had reviewed the Webb case file for 40 minutes on Sunday evening and concluded it was straightforward. He had 37 other files on his desk, a breakfast meeting Wednesday with the DA's deputy chief about a case that actually mattered for his career, and the preliminary evidence on Webb was clean officer's testimony, security footage. There was a note about a defense subpoena for private security footage he'd apparently need to look at. He'd deal with that and Colt's report. He organized his papers at the prosecution table on the morning of trial without looking up. In the front row of the gallery, Raymond Colt surveyed the room. He was 46 years old, a man who had been large for most of his adult life and had learned early what to do with that. 18 years on the Metro Force had given his instincts institutional backing and his prejudices the appearance of professional judgment. He wore his badge the way other Messieurs wore mamie brass knuckles, not as identification, but as a statement about the hierarchy of the room. He had been on the witness stand in this courthouse 14 times. He had been cross-examined by public defenders, by civil rights attorneys, by one lawyer 4 years ago who had come closest to landing something damaging before a sustained objection saved him. He had never been cross-examined by a pro-SE defendant. He looked at Marcus Webb at the defense table and felt the comfortable weight of a foregone conclusion. His partner, Officer Dale Pruitt, sat just behind the prosecution table. He was the only person in the room who looked afraid. Marcus noted it without adjusting his posture. Judge Patricia Howe emerged from chambers at precisely 8:58, silver hair, black robe, the brisk precision of a woman who had presided over murder trials and gang indictments and high-profile fraud cases and had zero tolerance for the kind of courtroom theatrics that wasted her time. She took the bench and looked at Marcus over her glasses. "Mr. Webb, I see you are still unrepresented by counsel. I advised against this at your arraignment. Are you certain you wish to proceed pro se? I'm your honor," Marcus said. His voice carried clearly to the bench, unhurried, resonant, stripped of everything except the measured confidence of a man who has made a decision and is at peace with it. Howe studied him for a beat longer than she usually studied pro se defendants, making a mental note she couldn't quite categorize, and moved on. "Mr. Forsyth, the state may call its first witness." Forsyth looked up from his papers, as though slightly surprised this was happening already. "The state calls Officer Raymond Colt." Colt swaggered to the witness stand with the unhurried confidence of a man conducting a familiar transaction. He settled into the witness chair and adopted the posture he always adopted on the stand, leaning slightly back-angled toward the judge rather than the examiner, the body language of a man being transparent with the court rather than performing for it. Under Forsyth's direct examination, the narrative arrived in its practiced form. The broken tail light. The Pinecrest neighborhood. The 11:52 hour. Marcus allegedly becoming belligerent at the window. Marcus allegedly refusing to hand over his license. Marcus allegedly stepping out of the vehicle aggressively. "He was acting erratic, Your Honor." Colt testified, his eyes on Howe, his voice carrying the sorrowful sincerity of a man who regrets that the facts are what they are. Waving his arms, "I genuinely feared he might have a weapon." He deployed the phrase, "I feared for my safety," the first time. The gallery murmured the quiet murmur of people who recognize a familiar story and have, through repetition, come to accept its premises. The woman with the speeding ticket in the third row shook her head slightly at Marcus. Forsyth nodded along, already thinking about Wednesday's breakfast meeting. Colt described Marcus's hands as clenched into fists. He described Marcus reaching toward his waistband. He described the taser deployment as a last resort measure after multiple ignored commands. He used the phrase, "I feared for my safety," a second time. Then a third. The third time was one too many. Marcus, watching from the defense table, clocked it as a teleman selling to his own internal audience, slightly overshooting. The phrase had been his armor in 17 internal affairs reviews, and it had always held. He didn't know how to stop deploying it, even when the room had already decided. "Thank you, Officer," Forsyth said, sitting back with the satisfaction of a task completed. "Your witness, Mr. Webb." Marcus stood. He picked up the yellow legal pad. He walked to the podium without hurrying, placed the pad on its surface, and looked at Raymond Colt for a long, unhurried moment without speaking. Not a theatrical pause, just the settling of a man who has decided on his first question and sees no reason to rush. He pressed one hand briefly to the outside of his breast pocket, feeling the folded transcript beneath the fabric. Then he lifted his eyes to the witness stand. "Officer Colt," he said, "you stated you pulled me over at 11:52 p.m. for a broken right tail light. Is that correct?" "That's right," Colt said. His voice had already acquired the slight curl of condescension that men like him produce when they've decided a challenge is beneath them. "And you stated that I was acting erratically, shouting, waving my arms behavior that made you fear for your safety. That's your sworn testimony." "It is." Marcus looked down at the legal pad. He let a beat of silence exist, the kind most people rush to fill. He had no interest in filling it. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and produced a document folded in thirds. "Officer Colt, my vehicle, the 2023 Dodge Charger, involved in this case, is leased from a dealership that operates a fleet management contract with a federal agency." Marcus approached the clerk's desk and placed the document in the receiving tray. "I have here a certified diagnostic report pulled from the vehicle's onboard computer system by that dealership the morning after the car was impounded. It covers all electrical systems as of the night of October 14th. He turned back to the podium. "It shows no electrical faults, no broken bulbs, no anomalies in the taillight assembly. Defense Exhibit A, Your Honor." Forsyth was on his feet with an objection about relevance. A bulb could have been loose or intermittently malfunctioning. How overruled and studied the document. Something in her expression shifted fractionally, the look of a woman who has just found that a piece of furniture she believed was solid is hollow. Continue, Mr. Webb. Officer Colt. Marcus turned back to the stand. You testified that I exited the vehicle myself and stepped toward you in a threatening manner. You said my hands were clenched into fists. Correct. Are you aware of the private security network in the Pinecrest neighborhood? Specifically, the high-definition camera mounted on the residential gate at 48 Rosewood Drive, which has a direct line of sight to the section of Pinecrest Avenue where you initiated the stop. The change was subtle, but complete. The jaw tightened. The blood vessel at Colt's left temple became visible in a way it hadn't been before. His eyes stopped moving and went still. I can't speak to private security installations, he said. I can, Marcus said quietly. He turned to the bench. Your Honor, I subpoenaed the footage from the camera at 48 Rosewood Drive. The homeowners cooperated fully. A copy was sent to the district attorney's office via certified mail 3 days ago. He looked at Forsyth. Mr. Forsyth signed the receipt. Forsyth was very still. I have not had the opportunity to fully review, Bailiff Judge Howe said, cutting him off with the efficiency of a woman who has heard every variation of that sentence set up the monitor. 2 minutes. Monroe produced the laptop, connected it to the courtroom's flat-screen display. The gallery shifted forward collectively. Even the court reporter angled her body toward the screen. The woman in the third row, who'd been clutching the speeding ticket citation since before proceedings, began a 53-year-old retired hospital administrator named Bernadette Holloway, who had arrived expecting to pay a fine and be gone in 30 minutes, set the citation down on the bench beside her and leaned forward with both hands on her knees. Marcus inserted the flash drive. The footage was high-definition infrared, the crisp monochrome of quality night vision recording ambient streetlight rendered with the clarity of a document. The timestamp read October 14th, 23:52. 08. Pinecrest Avenue, from a 45-degree overhead angle. Marcus's Charger smoothed to the curb. Colt's Cruiser behind it. A brief exchange at the driver's window. Marcus's arm extended, offering the license. Then Colt stepping back. And then what actually happened? Colt gripping the driver's door handle with both hands and yanking it open with a force that rocked the Charger on its suspension. Marcus's hands at the moment of that opening pressed flat against the interior of the roof above the window palms, out fingers spread in a posture that no living person on earth could honestly describe as a clenched fist. Colt reaching into the car and dragging Marcus out by the collar. Marcus's feet leaving the vehicle in an involuntary stumble, already off balance. Colt's hand driving to the back of Marcus's head, directing it toward the asphalt. Colt's knee in the lumbar curve of Marcus's spine. And then, with a terrible clarity that made the evidence argument unnecessary and the perjury charges inevitable, the moment Colt drew the taser and pressed it directly against the fabric of Marcus's jacket at the shoulder and fired it into a man who was not moving, not resisting, not doing a single thing except lying face down on a wet road. The gallery erupted. Not the ordinary murmur of a room processing information. Real sounds, sharp, involuntary. The sounds a person makes when the thing they're watching is not the thing they were prepared to watch. Someone at the back said something sharp and brief in a voice that cracked. One of the women from the second row had pressed her hand flat against her sternum. Bernadette Holloway, in the third row, had sat back against the bench with both hands in her lap and was staring at the frozen final frame with an expression that was the face of a person permanently done with a particular assumption. The court reporter had stopped typing. Judge Howe's gavel came down with the sharpness of something structural, giving way. Order. Order in this court. Her voice was controlled, but a register had dropped. A temperature had fallen. She looked at the frozen image on the monitor. She looked at Raymond Colt. Colt was gripping the front ledge of the witness box with both hands. His knuckles were white. The blood vessel pulsed at his temple. He was no longer leaning back. He looked in that moment like a man watching the only building he had ever trusted collapse, floor by floor, from the foundation up. Marcus had not looked at the monitor once during the playback. He had kept his eyes on Colt for the entire duration, watching the man's face, cataloging each fractional change, noting the exact moment the internal collapse became visible on the external surface. He waited for the room to settle. Then he spoke. "Officer Colt," he said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying with the quiet authority of a man who has given commands in situations where the consequences of ignoring them were permanent. "Would you like to revise your sworn testimony?" The silence after the question was the heaviest silence Courtroom 7 had produced all morning. Colt pulled his hands from the witness box ledge, with deliberate care, not releasing the grip so much as withdrawing it in stages, as though releasing too quickly would communicate what the grip itself had already communicated. He adjusted his weight in the chair. He attempted to reassemble his expression into something approaching authority. "The video doesn't show the full context," he said, his voice missing its earlier register, the practiced sincerity gone ragged at the edges. "It doesn't show what I observed through the window. It doesn't show him reaching under the seat before I opened the door." "Reaching under the seat," Marcus repeated. He tilted his head very slightly. "That's a new detail, officer. You didn't include that in your direct examination." It was part of what I observed." "I see." Marcus produced a second document from the briefcase. "I have here the official vehicle inventory report for the 2023 Dodge Charger. Impound number 44-C-2024, completed by your partner, Officer Dale Pruitt, on the night of October 14th at the impound facility." He walked it to the clerk. "Defense Exhibit B, Your Honor." Officer Pruitt's inventory lists the following contents of the Charger: 1 water bottle in the center console, 1 registration document in the glove compartment, 1 owner's manual in the glove compartment, 1 charging cable in the center console. A pause. No weapon. No contraband. The glove compartment was found open at time of impound, consistent with having been searched during the stop. He looked up at Colt. "If I was reaching under the seat, what was I reaching for?" Forsyth objected. Argumentative. Sustained. Officer Colt Marcus said, moving on without breaking rhythm. "Let's address procedure directly. Standard protocol, when an officer believes a subject may be reaching for a weapon, is to draw from a position of cover behind the engine block of the patrol vehicle and issue verbal commands. That is what every department training manual specifies. You did not draw. You did not retreat to cover. You holstered your weapon, crossed the distance to my door, and physically removed me from the vehicle." He kept his voice level, almost conversational, which was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. "That is not the action of an officer who feared for his life. That is the action of an officer who wanted physical contact." "Objection," Forsyth said, on his feet and more energized than he'd been since the footage played. "Counsel is testifying, badgering the witness." "Sustained," Howe said, but her eyes were on Colt. "Mr. Webb, keep to questions. Officer Colt, you are under oath. I suggest you remember the penalties for perjury." Colt's face had passed through red and was approaching purple. He was a man used to absolute compliance, used to people cowering, apologizing, backtracking. He was not used to being taken apart in public peace, by documented peace, by a man in a cheap gray suit who had not once raised his voice or broken his composure. "You don't know what it's like out there," Colt spat, pointing a thick finger at Marcus. The professional veneer was gone. What remained was the raw thing underneath it. "You sit here with your little papers and your videos trying to play lawyer. You're just a thug trying to game the system." Officer Jenkins Howe said sharply, "You will control yourself." Marcus did not react to the outburst. He reached into the briefcase and produced one final document. Defense Exhibit D, Your Honor. A Freedom of Information Act request, filed with the Metro Police Department regarding Officer Colt's complaint history over his period of employment. The response documents 17 excessive force complaints across 18 years of service. 14 involved unarmed black male subjects. 4 resulted in civil settlements paid by the city totaling $1,340,000. Objection, Forsyth said, standing. Highly prejudicial. Prior complaints are character evidence. This is character assassination. Sustained, Howe said. The record will not include the complaint figures. Mr. Webb, we are addressing the events of October 14th. Understood, Your Honor, Marcus said. He set the legal pad down. He turned his back on Raymond Colt and began walking toward the defense table. He took 3 steps. In the 13 seconds between Marcus's turned back and the moment Colt left the witness stand, something fundamental gave way. Not because of the diagnostic report, not because of the footage, not because of the protocol argument, or the toxicology, or the FOIA disclosure. Each of those things had been a structural blow, and each had done damage, but the structure had held. What finally dismantled it was the turned back, the physical fact of Marcus walking away, done with him, the verdict delivered in the quality of that departure. Raymond Colt's entire professional identity was organized around fear. The badge existed to produce it. The size, the voice, the 18 years, all of it was designed to convert every person he stood over into someone who was afraid of him. Even the lawyers who had come closest to landing something damaging had done so from a posture of visible anxiety. The elevated pulse, the over-preparation, the awareness of playing against a tilted system. This man had turned his back because he was finished with Colt. Not dismissing him out of indifference, finished with him. The way you finish with something that has no more useful function. And Colt's brain, under the catastrophic pressure of a career evaporating in a room full of witnesses on a court reporter's record, arrived at the only remaining option that his particular architecture of self could produce. If the situation cannot be won through the mechanisms that have always worked, recover it through the only other mechanism available. The logic was the logic of a man who has never in his professional life faced a consequence and therefore genuinely cannot imagine one. It was insane. It was given who Colt was and how he had operated for 18 years, completely inevitable. Marcus heard the squeak of Colt's leather soles on the linoleum before the man had covered half the distance. He felt the displacement of air that 250 pounds of forward-moving mass produces a pressure shift, subtle, the kind of thing most people's nervous systems are not calibrated to register, but that 12 years of SEAL training had hardwired into Marcus's threat detection architecture at a level well below conscious thought. He processed the angle of approach, the probable target, the back of his neck, exposed Colt intending to use momentum and mass to drive Marcus's face into the heavy oak of the defense table, and he processed it while Colt's hands were still 18 inches from contact. Marcus moved. What happened next occupied 3 seconds of real time. In those 3 seconds in front of Judge Patricia Howe, court reporter, Sandra Billings bailiff, Gerald Monroe, ADA, Nathan Forsyth, Dale Pruitt, Bernadette Holloway. In the third row, and approximately 19 other people whose testimony would subsequently be requested by federal investigators, the following occurred in a sequence too compressed for the human eye to fully parse in real time. Marcus dropped his center of gravity by 4 inches, a controlled descent of the hips, no stumble, no flinch, a precise adjustment executed by a body that had performed related movements enough times that the nervous system stored them below the level of deliberate thought. His left hand came up and back in a motion that to the gallery looked like someone reaching for something behind them. What it was, a controlled intercept of Colt's right wrist at the moment of maximum extension, fingers closing on the joint with a placement that had less to do with speed than with geometry. Not hard precise. Hardness is for strength, precision is for leverage, and leverage at a wrist joint properly applied renders hardness irrelevant. Marcus stepped outside Colt's body line, left foot crossing behind the right, a pivot that rotated his body entirely out of the attack vector, while his left hand maintained the wrist capture. This put him beside and slightly behind Colt, which was the worst possible position for Colt and the best possible position for everything that followed. He rotated the captured wrist with the joint's natural plane of motion, but past the point where Colt could comfortably maintain position, producing the specific sensation at the elbow and shoulder that the human nervous system categorizes as urgently requiring resolution. Colt's body automatically followed his arm in the direction of least resistance, which was down and forward. The leg sweep converted Colt's forward momentum into a downward arc. Marcus's right leg extended across Colt's right ankle at the exact moment Colt's weight had fully committed to the forward direction. There was no contest between the physics and the man. Colt's 250-pound frame hit the courtroom floor face first. The sound was enormous, a crack and a thud combined that transmitted through the gallery benches and into the people sitting on them as a physical vibration. Colt's arms had not had time to come forward. Marcus's left hand had maintained the wrist capture through the entire motion and brought both of Colt's arms behind him before Colt's brain, Jinnishiyati, had registered that he was falling. Marcus's knee settled on the back of Colt's neck. Not the throat. Never the throat. He knew exactly where those structures were and what pressure on them produced. He placed it at the junction of the second and third cervical vertebrae, where a controlled application of 40 pounds of downward pressure interrupted motor signals to the upper limbs without producing any respiratory or circulatory effect. Colt's arms went slack. He was completely, precisely immobilized. Colt made a sound, high-pitched, involuntary, entirely unlike any sound he had made in the preceding 90 minutes. His cheek was pressed against the courtroom linoleum, dirty from the morning's foot traffic, gritty and cold. He could see the legs of his own abandoned witness chair across the room. He tried to move his arms. He could not. He tried to push with his legs. The geometry of his position made this a theoretical exercise. The man who had spent 18 years deciding the positions other people ended up in was face down on a floor held in place by 40 pounds and physics, and the floor smelled of industrial cleaner and the accumulated humiliations of everyone who had ever stood before a judge in this room and lost. In the gallery, absolute pandemonium. The gallery erupted upward. Bernadette Holloway in the third row was on her feet with both hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide, the speeding citation abandoned entirely on the bench beside her. Forsyth had gone backward over his own chair, half standing, when the motion started the sudden crack of Colt hitting the floor, completing what physics had begun and ended against the gallery railing with both hands out for balance and an expression of total cognitive shutdown. Pruitt had not moved at all. He was sitting in his chair with his hands flat on his knees, staring at the American flag behind the bench, breathing with the careful deliberateness of a man who has just done a rapid calculation about where to put his attention. Monroe had his weapon half drawn. His training said draw on a threat. There was clearly a threat in this room. He had gotten to the drawing stage before the additional information arrived. The threat was a police officer. The police officer was face down, and the man who had put him there was looking at Monroe with the expression of a person watching a situation that does not require the intervention he is considering. Bailiff Marcus said. His voice projected clearly over the noise, the way trained voices do not loud placed correctly enough diaphragm that it carried without effort. Lower your weapon. I am performing a lawful citizen's arrest on this man for aggravated assault in the presence of a judge. My knee is applying non-lethal compliance pressure at the C2 to C3 junction. He is not in danger, provided he does not struggle. If you discharge your weapon at this angle and proximity, there is a significant probability that the round will penetrate and injure the man you're looking at. He waited for Monroe to process this. He's right, Bernadette Holloway said from the third row. Her voice was steady. He's not moving. He has him controlled. She had worked in hospital administration for 22 years. She knew what controlled looked like and what panic looked like, and she was looking at one of each. Order Howe's voice cut through the room with the authority of a woman who has spent 22 years being the most powerful person in her courtroom and has absolutely no intention of ceding that position to chaos. She was on her feet. Everyone sit down. Bailiff Monroe, lower your weapon immediately. Mr. Webb, release Officer Colt. Marcus looked up at the bench. He met Howe's eyes across the room. Your Honor, he said with the precise, respectful tone of a man who is going to decline a direct order and wants to be honest about it. Officer Colt is currently armed with a Glock 22, a taser, and OC spray. He has just demonstrated on the record of this proceeding severe emotional dysregulation and violent intent. Until he is disarmed by a sworn officer releasing him, constitutes a tactical risk I am not willing to accept. A beat. He's not wrong, Forsyth said from the railing, surprising himself again. Howe looked at Monroe. Gerald, take Officer Colt's weapons. All of them. Now. Monroe holstered his own weapon. He approached with the careful movements of a man navigating terrain he doesn't have a map for, and he knelt and unclipped Colt's duty belt and slid the heavy rig across the linoleum until it fetched against the base of the clerk's desk. Marcus released the joint lock in one smooth motion, stood, and stepped back 3 paces. He brushed a small amount of linoleum dust from the left lapel of his $23 jacket. He straightened his tie. Colt scrambled to his feet, clutching his right elbow. His face mottled red and white in patches. His expression, the expression of a man who has been physically demonstrated to be exactly what he has always been told he was not. He looked at Marcus with a hatred that was almost structural in its density. "You're dead," he said. His voice was ragged, all the professional polish gone, the raw thing completely visible. "You assaulted a police officer. You're going away for the rest of your life." Marcus finished straightening his tie. He turned to the bench. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying the clean finality of someone who has arrived at the place they intended to arrive at. "As a victim of an unprovoked physical assault committed in your courtroom, witnessed by yourself, by court staff, by the district attorney's representative, and by members of the public, I would like to invoke my right to make one phone call." Howe stared at him. The anger of the moment was still in her face, but something larger had begun moving behind it. The beginning of a much bigger question assembling itself. "Mr. Webb," she said slowly, "you are not the individual under arrest here." "No, Your Honor," Marcus agreed. "Then what precisely?" "Because I am not a private citizen," Marcus said. He reached into his jacket's inner breast pocket. His fingers passed over the folded transcript. 53 seconds, zebrafish his brother, running out of breath from the joy of a discovery, and continued to the pocket behind it, where the satellite communicator rested in its matte black casing. He produced it and held it at his side. And this was never a traffic stop. The communicator's activation sequence took 4 seconds. 3 digits confirmation, second set of 3. Marcus raised it to his ear as the encrypted satellite relay established connection, bypassing every civilian communication infrastructure in the state of Georgia, routing through a military-grade channel that no one in this room had clearance to monitor. Absolute silence in courtroom 7. Even Colt had stopped moving. "Control," Marcus said. His voice was flat, operational, stripped of every emotion that had been present moments before. This was a different register entirely. The voice of a man filing a report, precise and economical. "This is Chief Webb. Authentication Alpha Romeo 79er. Confirm identity. 3-second verification cycle." The target escalated to Phase 4. Physical assault on a federal task force officer in open court. Fully documented on county audio-visual record and court reporter transcript. "I am invoking the Phase 4 protocol. Execute." 11 seconds of listening, then a single nod. Confirmed. He ended the call and slipped the communicator back into his jacket pocket. His hand rested for a moment on the outside of the breast pocket, briefly, barely perceptible, and then came away. He walked to the bench. He set his briefcase on the defense table, opened it, and retrieved a sealed manila envelope from the compartment above the false bottom. He placed it on the surface of the bench in front of Judge Howe. "Your Honor, my name is Marcus Webb, Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy SEAL Team 3. I am operating under a joint mandate issued by the Naval Criminal Investigative Service and the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division." He waited for that to arrive. "The vehicle I drove on the night of October 14th was not a civilian vehicle. It was a federally supplied surveillance platform equipped with 4 concealed 4K recording units, biometric sensors, and a live uplink to an FBI technical team positioned on Ashford Lane, 3 blocks from the stop location. Every second of my interaction with Officer Colt on that street was captured simultaneously on 4 camera angles and transmitted in real time to federal agents." He gestured to the envelope. "Inside is a sworn affidavit from Special Agent Dana Reeves of the DOJ Civil Rights Division authorizing my deep-cover deployment. It bears the co-signature of the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights." He let the room absorb this. He watched it happen, the information moving through the gallery in a wave, each person receiving it, recalibrating, arriving at new understanding with a slightly different expression of the same stunned recognition. He looked at Raymond Colt. He didn't know who I was, Marcus said. He saw a black man in an expensive car in a neighborhood he had designated as his territory, and his established pattern of predatory behavior took over automatically. He spent 18 years profiling men in this neighborhood on the basis of what they drove and what they wore. A beat. We gave him exactly the clothes and the car he was looking for. He paused there, and in the silence, a different quality of understanding moved through the room. The specific understanding that arrives when people recognize that the thing they thought they were watching was not the thing that was actually happening. That the man in the cheap gray suit at the defense table had been, from the moment he sat down, the architect of everything that had occurred in this room since the gavel fell. The rear doors of courtroom 7 opened. The doors opened without drama, not kicked, not burst. They opened the way federal agents open doors when they have already won, with the controlled precision of people for whom force is available and will not be needed. 6 individuals in dark suits entered in a line and moved down the center aisle with the practiced economy of a team accustomed to arriving in rooms that weren't expecting them. Leading them was Special Agent Dana Reeves. She was 44 years old, with the kind of face that cataloged everything it encountered and disclosed nothing of what it found. She moved with the quiet authority of a woman who had spent 20 years in federal law enforcement, being consistently underestimated, and had long since stopped adjusting her behavior around anyone else's expectations of her. She had been 3 blocks away for the past 94 minutes in a federal vehicle on Ashford Lane, monitoring the live feed from the technical van, the collar transmitter, the court audio relay, all 4 camera angles from the bait car transmitted for documentation. Tracking every word spoken in courtroom 7 with the focused attention of a surgeon observing a procedure she had designed. When Colt's chair had scraped back from the witness stand, she had said one word to her team: move. She presented credentials to Howe with the calm efficiency of a woman for whom this gesture is completely ordinary. Special Agent Dana Reeves, Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. Your Honor. I apologize for the intrusion into your proceedings. My team was monitoring the audio feed from Chief Webb's operational transmitter. When the subject initiated a physical assault on a federal task force officer in open court, we were required to respond. Howe looked at the credentials. She looked at Marcus. She looked at Colt, who had been edged toward the gallery railing by 2 of Reeves's agents, and stood there clutching his elbow, with the expression of a man watching the only structure he has ever trusted dissolve. Agent Reeves Howe said, choosing her words with the care of a woman who has processed an enormous amount in a very short time, "Are you telling me that this proceeding in my courtroom was a component of a federal sting operation targeting Officer Colt?" "Not the proceeding, Your Honor," Reeves said. "The proceeding was the stage Officer Colt chose. We provided the materials. He built the scenario himself." She paused. "The trial was the rope. He tied the noose, stepped onto the stool, and kicked it away." She turned to Forsythe. The young ADA was standing beside his overturned chair with the expression of a man calculating very quickly what the next several months of his life were going to look like, and arriving at answers he wished he hadn't. "Mr. Forsythe, your office dismissed, misclassified, or declined to forward 17 excessive force complaints against Officer Colt in the past 4 years. District Attorney Harold Greer has accepted $8,000 in campaign contributions from the Metro Police Benevolent Fund and has publicly endorsed the union's preferred candidate in both recent election cycles." She delivered this without particular inflection, the recitation of documented facts. "We did not brief your office because we could not trust your office. That is on the record." Forsythe opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the court reporter who was typing steadily. He picked up his pen from the floor and did not seem to know what to do with it. He sat down. In the front row of the gallery, Dale Pruitt had not moved. He was staring at the American flag behind the bench with the concentrated intensity of a man who has decided that flag is the one object in this room he can look at safely. Reeves produced the federal warrant from her jacket's inner pocket and held it at reading height for the record for the court reporter for the clarity of the moment. Raymond Thomas Colt. Her voice was level and entirely without theater. The voice of a professional reading a document. "You are being charged with deprivation of rights under color of law, a violation of Title 18 United States Code. Section 242, covering the events of October 14th and 17 prior documented incidents. You are additionally charged with aggravated assault on a federal task force officer for the events of this morning. Perjury, 3 counts corresponding to your 3 sworn statements claiming you feared for your safety, and obstruction of justice for the deliberate deletion and misfiling of dash camera recordings from 14 separate traffic stops conducted between January and September of this year. She continued. At 7:43 that morning, while Courtroom 7 was in session, an FBI tactical team had executed a search warrant at the 4th Precinct evidence locker. They had recovered dash camera recordings Colt had believed deleted. Recovered from the hardware through forensic imaging, along with 2 prepaid cellular devices used to coordinate with informants and arrange cash transfers. At 7:51, Officer Dale Pruitt had been taken into federal custody at his home. He had provided a full proffer statement at 8:14 after 8 minutes in the interrogation room. His statement confirmed, among other things, that a quantity of narcotics, a sealed bag of cocaine, presented as evidence in the arrest of a Jalen Cross on September 2nd, had not been found in Cross's vehicle. It had been placed there by Officer Colt after Cross was already on the ground. The mention of the name produced a silence of a different quality from anything the room had generated before. Bernadette Holloway, in the 3rd row, pressed her lips together. The teenage boy, whose mother had been straightening his collar, had been watching with his elbows on his knees since the footage played, and now he was very still. Is there a Jalen Cross currently incarcerated in the Georgia state system based on charges from Officer Colt's arrest? How? Asked. Something had left her voice, not authority, which was entirely present, but the professional distance that usually insulates a judge from the specific human weight of what she presides over. Yes, Your Honor, Reeves said. Jalen Cross, 22 years old. Georgia State University sophomore, biology major. He has been serving a 4-year sentence at Ware State Prison for 11 months. His family was notified of the federal investigation this morning. Howe was quiet. Get him out, she said. Not a legal order. No case number, no procedural architecture. Simply what a human being says when they have encountered a specific named injustice and have the power to address it. Colt's final attempt, I was protecting the neighborhood. His voice had lost everything that had made it a voice of authority. It was just sound now. Silence, Howe said. 1 word. It landed. Reeves signaled 2 fingers. 2 agents moved to flank Colt, not roughly, not with ceremony. They simply placed themselves at angles that converted his available space from open to enclosed, and the geometry communicated what words would have taken longer to say. Colt looked at Monroe. 9 years in this building together. Lunch on dozens of Tuesdays. Complaints about the parking situation and the broken coffee machine on the 3rd floor. Monroe was looking at the American flag. Colt looked at Forsyth. Forsyth was organizing papers with the unnecessary care of a man who needs something to do with his hands. Colt looked at Marcus. Marcus had walked to the bailiff's station at the edge of the room where Colt's duty belt had come to rest against the clerk's desk base. He crouched and examined the belt briefly, then located the handcuff case on its right side and unclipped it. He straightened, holding Colt's own cuffs in one hand, and crossed to the agent closest to Colt. He didn't say anything. He held out the cuffs and looked at the agent. The agent took them with a brief nod that carried a quality of comprehension that required no elaboration. The sound of the cuffs ratcheting onto Colt's wrists, click, click, was small and exact and complete. It was the same sound Colt had produced on Raymond Webb's wrists on a rain-soaked street in Pinecrest. It was the same sound that had accompanied the arrest of Jalen Cross and the 17 other names in Colt's complaint file, and the unknown additional number whose complaints had never made it to paper. The room heard it in the silence. Every person in the gallery understood the sound. Most of them had lived their lives in proximity to it, in the awareness of it, in the specific watchfulness that the knowledge of that sound and what it represents produces in people who have reason to think about it. They heard it now on entirely different terms. Colt was walked to the center aisle. The FBI agents flanked him without ceremony. The courtroom's architecture, designed to move people up the aisle, through the swinging gate toward the bench, toward judgment, was working in reverse, moving Colt in the direction of the doors, away from the power he'd occupied, back through the gallery. He began to cry somewhere in the middle of the aisle. Not quietly. The crying of a man who has nothing left to maintain. His sobs reached the hallway before the double doors swung shut behind him and cut off the sound. Marcus stood at the defense table and watched him go. He kept his face still. He allowed himself in the private territory of his own chest one single beat of something that was not triumph but occupied the same neighborhood, the cold, specific satisfaction of a mission that has achieved every objective in the order they were planned. Then he thought about Damon searching for the word careful while Marcus sat 3 feet away holding perfectly still so the search wouldn't become a performance. The satisfaction became something quieter and more permanent. Howe called Marcus forward with a gesture, not the imperious summons of a judge managing a docket, but the quieter motion of a person who has something specific to say to one specific individual and wants the distance to be appropriate for it. Marcus stood before the bench. Behind him, Reeves was directing agents in low conversation with the clerk about evidence chain of custody. Forsyth had quietly disappeared. The gallery had thinned most of the morning. Docket people had collected themselves and drifted out during the FBI's entrance, their own minor matters pulling them back to the ordinary demands of Tuesday. Bernadette Holloway had not left. She was sitting in the third row with her speeding citation on her lap and her hands folded on top of it, watching. Chief Webb Howe said. She took a breath. "I want to say something to you that isn't for the record." A pause. "When you appeared before me at arraignment and informed me you would be representing yourself, I concluded you were either arrogant or foolish, and I was generous enough to reserve judgment between the two." She looked at him over the top of her glasses. "I see now that neither characterization was accurate, and that the only fool in this room today was the man who thought he could break you." "The plan was built by a federal team over 4 months, Marcus said. "I was its instrument." "You volunteered to be the instrument," Howe said. "That distinction matters considerably." She straightened a paper on the bench that didn't need straightening. "You have requests for the court. 3. Dismissal of all charges with extreme prejudice on the record. A judicial order requiring the DA's office to conduct a comprehensive review of every conviction in this county where Officer Colt served as primary arresting officer. And a letter from Your Honor to the federal sentencing judge when Colt's trial concludes." Howe nodded with the decisive efficiency of a woman whose history had prepared her to make significant decisions quickly when the facts required it. Granted, and I will write that letter personally." A brief pause. "I'm adding a 4th. I am writing to the State Bar's Ethics Committee, recommending an investigation into Harold Greer for his office's pattern of handling Colt's complaint history. The record of this proceeding provides sufficient foundation." "That wasn't on my list," Marcus said. "It's on mine," Howe said. The gavel came down once, not with the violence of a room requiring control, but with the finality of something decided that will not be undecided. Marcus picked up his briefcase. He straightened his jacket, the $23 jacket from the Goodwill donation bin, its sleeves still a full inch too long. He walked back through the swinging wooden gate of the defense area, past the gallery, past Bernadette Holloway, who watched him go with an expression he didn't see because he was already moving, and through the rear doors of courtroom 7. The doors swung shut behind him, with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. 3 days after the trial, Marcus picked up Damon from the apartment on Ponce de Leon Avenue and drove him to the VA Medical Center on Claremont Road for his follow-up audiology appointment. Damon talked most of the way there about a paper he'd been reading about a technique Dr. Harris had shown him in the lab, about a documentary he'd watched the night before about deep-sea bioluminescence that had kept him up until 2 in the morning because he couldn't stop thinking about it. The words came at the pace they came now, not the rushing velocity of the voice messages from before, but steadier than they'd been in the hospital, fuller than they'd been in the early weeks. A grid coming back on district by district. Marcus drove and listened, and said almost nothing, which was its own form of attention. The audiologist's report took 40 minutes. Marcus sat in the waiting room under fluorescent lights that buzzed at a frequency just below conscious irritation. Slightly different pitch from courtroom 7. Same basic complaint, and did not look at his phone. When the audiologist brought him in, He sat in the chair beside Damon's and listened to the results delivered in the careful, compassionate language of a professional who has learned to present difficult information as information rather than verdict. No recovery in the left ear, no change from the baseline established 4 months ago. The cochlear structures were consistent with the prior assessment. They would continue to monitor, but the current data did not indicate a trajectory toward improvement. Damon listened to this with his hands folded in his lap and an expression of such composed equanimity that Marcus, watching him, felt something move in his chest that he couldn't have named and wouldn't have named if he could. Damon was 22 years old. He had been handed a permanent loss at 22 years old, and he was sitting in a medical chair, receiving its confirmation with his hands folded and his chin level and his eyes clear. The same brightness, still there. The same readiness to find the interesting thing intact. Entirely intact, the quality of him unchanged by what had been taken. In the parking lot afterward, Marcus told him the core of it. Not the operational details, those were federally restricted. The core. The officer who hurt you is in federal custody. He's not going to do this to anyone else. Damon was quiet for a while. He looked at the parking lot. He looked at his hands. "Are you okay?" he asked. Not what Marcus had anticipated. Not a question about Colt or the case or what comes next. A question about Marcus. "I will be," Marcus said. Damon nodded slowly. He looked at the middle distance for a moment with the expression of a man checking on something internal. "I want to go back to the lab," he said. "Dr. Harris said the position's still available." A pause the search. "I want to go back. The work is still good." "Okay," Marcus said. "I can still hear everything on the right side," Damon said. "It's just one side that's different now. But the work is—" He stopped. Found it. Intact. Marcus put his hand briefly on the back of his brother's neck, the gesture that had survived from childhood, without either of them ever deciding to keep it. The debrief with Reeves happened 4 days later at the DOJ field office on Spring Street. 2 of her staff attorneys present the conversation classified. Reeves was thorough in the way she was always thorough each phase, each decision point, each deviation from protocol or absence thereof. She asked questions with the specificity of a professional who needs precise answers and has developed the ability to recognize when she's receiving approximate ones. At one point, she set down her pen and looked at Marcus directly. "I want to note for the debrief record," she said, "that you absorbed a taser deployment at close range on the stop night, sustained a grade 2 concussion, endured booking procedures, and sat through 90 minutes of active federal testimony, while the subject attempted to construct a conviction against you, and maintained 0 operational deviation throughout all of it. I've run 23 undercover operations. I have never worked with anyone who held that level of composure under sustained live duress." She paused. "What was your stabilizing mechanism?" Marcus considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "My brother sent me a voice message 6 weeks before the stop," he said, 53 seconds, about a paper he was reading on cochlear regeneration, about how hearing cells can rebuild themselves under very specific conditions. He ran out of breath twice because he was so excited about it. He paused. "I printed a transcript and carried it in my breast pocket the entire operation. Every time I felt pressure toward a response that would have broken the mission, I thought about the voice that sent that message and the distance between that voice and what Colt left him with, and I held still." Reeves looked at him for a moment. Then she made a note on her legal pad. She told him about the 3 other jurisdictions, different cities, different officers, the same basic infrastructure of protected corruption, the same pattern of complaint suppression. Institutional cover communities absorbing harm because the mechanism that was supposed to address the harm had been captured by the people producing it. She wasn't asking him today, she said. She was telling him the question existed. Marcus said he'd need 30 days. She said 30 days was fine. He used 28 of them in Atlanta, mostly with his family. He ate his mother's cooking and watched Damon's language continue its return slower than before the injury, steadier than it had been in the hospital. The words arriving with increasing reliability as the neural pathways found their alternate routes. He sat in the research lab for an hour, One afternoon, at Damon's invitation, listening to Dr. Harris describe the project, watching his brother take notes with the focused attention of a man for whom the work is genuinely the point. He drove through Pinecrest twice, once at noon and once at midnight, in his own car with no operational purpose, just looking at the street. On the 28th day, he packed a bag and drove to the airport. 6 weeks after the trial, the federal consent decree landed on the Metro Police Department with the weight of a structure that had been inevitable for years and had only needed the specific application of pressure that the Colt case provided to become real. The decree was 47 pages. Its terms had been negotiated across 5 weeks of intensive sessions and produced a document so comprehensive that the department's own administrative attorneys spent 3 days reading it before they were prepared to discuss it. The terms were not aspirational. They were requirements with enforcement mechanisms, with reporting timelines, with consequences for non-compliance specified in language that admitted no creative interpretation. Body cameras, mandatory department-wide. Footage archived to an encrypted cloud system managed by the Federal Compliance Monitor. No individual officer, supervisor, precinct captain, or department official had deletion or modification access. The archive was audited monthly by a civilian oversight board with full subpoena authority and the right to retain independent counsel. The board's majority membership was required to have no current or prior law enforcement affiliation. Quarterly audits of arrest and detention records compared against hospital admission data, court records, and citizen complaint filings. Cross-referencing what the department reported against what had actually happened. The audits produced mandatory responses within 30 days, documented and reported to the Federal Monitor. Not reviewed, not considered, responded to. The review of convictions took longer than the decree itself because there were more of them than anyone outside the federal investigation had been prepared for. The scope of what Colt and Pruitt had been running, what Pruitt's recovered text messages called the program, extended further back and wider across the county than the Pinecrest operation alone. 38 convictions were formally identified for review. The joint team of DOJ attorneys and independent public defenders examined each case against evidence presented, evidence withheld, and evidence manufactured. 31 were overturned on appeal. The overturnings happened in courtrooms on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, in small rooms, with small groups of family members, attorneys making procedural motions in the measured language of legal proceedings. Most of it received no coverage. But for the men who walked out of those courtrooms, fathers, sons, brothers, men who had structured their lives around a sentence that was not theirs, the absence of an audience did not diminish the moment. Jalen Cross was released 14 months and 11 days into his 4-year sentence. The processing was completed on a Thursday morning. His mother, Claudette Cross, had been at the facility since 5:45. She had painted a sign herself the night before poster board the kitchen of her apartment in Decatur, 2 a.m, because she couldn't sleep the letters large and bright and slightly uneven, "Welcome home." She was holding it when the doors opened. A reporter from the Atlanta Constitution, who had been covering the Colt case since the trial, was there to photograph it. The photograph Claudette Cross holding her handmade sign with her arms around her son, both of them with their eyes closed in the way people close their eyes when what they are feeling is too large to look at directly, was shared 400,000 times in the first 36 hours after publication. People shared it mostly without caption, without commentary, because the image contained everything that words would have reduced. Bernadette Holloway, who had sat in the 3rd row of courtroom 7, holding a speeding citation she never paid because the fine was eventually waived in the administrative chaos following the case, shared the photograph on the evening of its publication. Beneath it, she wrote 4 words, "I was in there." Harold Greer, the Cobb County District Attorney, released a resignation statement 11 days before the State Bar Ethics Committee was scheduled to begin its investigation. Personal reasons. The demands of public service. Time for reflection. The statement appeared at 4:45 on a Friday afternoon, the traditional timing of people who hope to be swallowed by the end of the news cycle. 3 civil rights organizations published a joint response within 20 minutes naming every specific decision Greer had made regarding Colt's complaint history and announcing their intent to pursue the ethics investigation regardless of his employment status. The Metropolitan Police Officers Benevolent Fund, which had spent $340,000 defending Colt against complaints across 3 years, announced a new era of transparency and community accountability in a statement on its website. The announcement did not mention Colt's name. It did not mention the $340,000. The Atlanta branch of the ACLU published both figures in the response thread sourced from public records. None of it was sufficient. The people who work in accountability say that about every outcome, not because nothing has been accomplished, but because the measure they're working against is the baseline that existed before the harm began, and you cannot fully restore what was taken. What you can do is close the mechanism and hold the people who operated it to account and document the gap clearly enough that denial requires extraordinary effort. That is what the consent decree did. That is what the review process did. That is what Claudette Cross's handmade sign did in a register those documents couldn't reach. The federal trial of Raymond Colt lasted 3 weeks, less than the prosecution had planned for, and considerably less than the defense had hoped. Colt's attorney, a former state court judge named Harrison Woodfield, who had built a criminal defense practice on a reputation that predated this case, had spent pretrial motions attempting to argue entrapment and had been denied at every juncture. The entrapment defense requires that the government induce the subject to commit a crime they were otherwise unlikely to commit. The government's documentation of 16 prior identical incidents, all without federal inducement, made this argument function as its own refutation. Dale Pruitt testified for the prosecution across 2 sessions totaling 4 hours. His immunity agreement required complete cooperation and full truthfulness, and he delivered both with the thoroughness of a man who has determined that his best path forward is to be remembered as someone who, given one opportunity to do the right thing, did it without reservation. He described the Pinecrest operation, what the text messages called the program, in granular detail, the method of target identification, the amounts extracted, the cash division, the communication codes used to reference the collections without naming them. He described the process for identifying and deleting problematic dash camera footage. He described the habit of camera malfunctions Colt had cultivated over years as a documented baseline so that future malfunctions would appear routine. He described Jalen Cross. He described it without looking at Colt, without looking at the jury. He looked at the prosecutor's table and delivered the account with the flat, careful accuracy of a man reading from a document he has committed to memory. The sealed bag, the jacket pocket, the trunk, the arrest report Colt wrote afterward. The courtroom was very quiet during that part. The bait car footage played on a screen facing the jury box. All 4 simultaneous angles in split-screen format, the technical expert had prepared the presentation with care. 4 perspectives on the same 30 seconds of Pinecrest Avenue on a rain-soaked October night. Marcus's hands at 10 and 2. The window lowered. The license extended. Colt's approach. The door yanked open. Marcus's hands flat and visible at the moment of that opening. What followed? 2 jurors winced audibly when the taser fired. The foreman, a retired county health department administrator who had the particular quality of attention that comes from decades of reading data, carefully watched the footage to its end, and then spent 30 seconds looking at the defense table before returning her gaze to the screen. Woodfield did not dispute the footage. His argument was institutional. Colt was a product of a department that had trained and rewarded this behavior, and the individuals and structures that had permitted that culture bore responsibility alongside the officer who enacted it. He asked for leniency on institutional grounds. The prosecutor played the caller-transmitter audio. "That's what happens when you drive a car that isn't yours, son." Colt's voice. In the quiet federal courtroom, the words he had whispered into the fiber of Marcus's collar on a rain-soaked street, recorded by a transmitter the size of a postage stamp, in the belief that he was alone with a man he had decided mattered less than his own convenience. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 40 minutes. They returned 19 guilty verdicts. The sentencing was before the Honorable Walter Gaines, a federal judge of 63, with the bearing of a man who has spent a career measuring the distance between what the law says and what justice requires, and who has made his peace with the fact that the measurement never comes out exactly right, but that the attempt is still worth making. He received Judge Howe's letter before the hearing, 4 pages, the precise language of a Superior Court jurist describing what she had witnessed on a Tuesday morning in courtroom 7 and what the 4th Precinct records suggested about the duration and scope of the conduct. He read it in his chambers alone and sat with it for a few minutes before going out to the bench. He sentenced Raymond Colt to 22 years in a federal penitentiary. No protective custody arrangement. No early parole consideration. General population. When Colt heard the words general population, the sound he produced was involuntary and extended and did not belong in a federal courthouse. His attorney put a hand on his shoulder. It did not help. Judge Howe's letter had ended with 7 words: he should receive no special consideration whatsoever. On the afternoon of Colt's sentencing, Marcus Webb was standing on the observation platform of a naval air station in Norfolk, Virginia, in his dress blues, watching a carrier training exercise run its pattern over the gray January Atlantic. The water was the color that happens when blue and gray and green stop arguing and arrive at something colder than all 3. A carrier-based aircraft came in low over the chop on a practice approach, its engines at the frequency Marcus's body recognized before his mind caught up the particular register of machinery built for a specific purpose, operating exactly as designed. His phone was in his chest pocket. It vibrated once. He took it out. 1 message from Reeves, 19 counts. 22 years. Jalen Cross started classes again this morning. Good work, Chief. He read it twice. He deleted it. He stood at the railing for a while without moving and let the wind off the Atlantic do what it wanted with his cover. He thought about a $23 suit hanging in a closet in Marietta, its sleeves still an inch too long, and about the folded transcript he had carried in the breast pocket through every phase of the operation. 53 seconds of his brother running out of breath over zebrafish, over the possibility that lost things might rebuild themselves under very specific conditions. He thought about Damon in the research lab with his notebook open and his right ear turned toward Dr. Harris's voice, and his particular quality of brightness completely intact, the same readiness to find the interesting thing, the same enthusiasm that had always made Marcus feel something he didn't have precise language for and had never needed. He thought about Claudette Cross at a prison gate at 5:45 in the morning holding a handmade sign. He thought about Bernadette Holloway in the 3rd row, setting down a speeding citation and leaning forward on her elbows because what she was about to see mattered. Raymond Colt had spent 18 years deciding who belonged in his city based on what they drove and what they wore. He had looked at a cheap gray suit and seen a target. He had not seen 12 years of SEAL training. He had not seen 4 deployments. He had not seen the 4 months of federal planning or the 4 4K cameras in the car he'd pulled over, or the transmitter in the collar he'd leaned in close to. He had not seen the quiet man at the defense table making one final check of the breast pocket before the gavel fell. That is what arrogance produces in the end, a blindness so complete that the trap looks like opportunity, right up until the floor comes up. Marcus picked up his cover from the railing where he had rested it, set it on his head with the flat precision of 12 years of habit, and walked back toward the base, toward the training schedules, and the next briefing, and wherever Reeves's next file was going to send him. The ocean stayed behind him, gal and enormous, and entirely indifferent to what any single person can or cannot accomplish against the weight of things that have been allowed to persist too long. Marcus had stopped finding that indifference discouraging. The attempt was the point. The attempt was always the point. He had a particular talent for proving that kind of certainty wrong. Raymond Colt walked into courtroom 7 expecting to ruin a man's life with a lie he had told 17 times before. He found instead that the room had been built around him while he wasn't watching every exit sealed every surface, recording the man at the defense table, not the prey he'd expected, but the architect of his own undoing. He spent 18 years deciding who belonged in this city based on what they wore and what they drove. He looked at a $23 suit and saw a target. He didn't see the operator behind it. He never does. That is the specific terminal blindness that arrogance produces. It sees only what it wants to see, right up until it can no longer see anything at all. True justice doesn't always arrive with sirens. Sometimes it arrives in a cheap suit with a legal pad and one phone call. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel. We'll be here.